Today we're going to be discussing what most scholars, theologians, pastors, and psychologists say is the most powerful force in the entire universe. If we can understand and practice what we talk about today, our lives will literally begin to change right before our very eyes. And I'm not setting you up. I don't think I'm being sensational. I believe any therapist would agree that today's discussion has the potential to change your life. At the same time, it's not an easy topic. In fact, it might be the most difficult. Putting into practice what we're discussing today will require so much from us that many of us might never get there. To start, I want to show you this picture. Does anyone remember this scene from about 8 years ago? This is a photo of an Amish community in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, on their way to the funeral of 5 girls who were tragically killed by a man named Charles Roberts. On October 2nd, 2006, Roberts walked into the one-room schoolhouse, barricaded the doors, and opened fire on 10 girls, killing 5 of them. He then turned the gun on himself. It was national news. Tragedy had struck this small Pennsylvania village. But the news that came out in the hours and days after the shooting was not just one of loss, but one of hope, if you can imagine that. It's now been widely reported that the posture the Amish community took with the killer and the killer's family was one of forgiveness. Hours after the shootings, several Amish, acting on their own, walked to the homes of the shooter's widow and parents to offer sympathy and extend forgiveness. One Amish man held Robert's sobbing father in his arms, reportedly for as long as an hour, simply to comfort him. When a local bank set up a fund for Robert's children, the Amish contributed. And when their own community received donations in the aftermath of the tragedy, they shared some of those funds with the Roberts widow. Donald Craybill, who's the co-author of a book called Amish Grace, writes, "I think the most powerful demonstration of the depth of Amish forgiveness was when members of the Amish community went to the killer's burial service at the cemetery. Several families, Amish families who had buried their own daughters just the day before, were in attendance, and they hugged the widow and hugged other members of the killer's family." Now let me ask you, does this story cause you to ask questions like, who are these people? And how is it possible to bury your own children and then embrace the killer's family the following day? How could someone offer forgiveness so quickly and so radically? Why would they want to? Well, the Amish community is in no way perfect, but their actions in the wake of such great tragedy paint a vivid picture of radical forgiveness, what some might even call questionable forgiveness. Now, today we're in week 2 of our series, A Questionable Life, where we're asking one another, is there anything about our lives that would cause people to ask, who are you? And why are you doing that? Is there anything about our lives that stand out as truly countercultural, or do our lives look pretty much like everyone else's? How do we live lives that evoke curiosity? How do we live lives that spark questions? How do we live lives that give us the opportunity to share our story about the difference Jesus is making in our lives? The challenge in this series is to live a questionable life. And today we're talking about questionable forgiveness. Like I mentioned before, the story I told you about the Amish certainly evokes questions. And a lot of us may think, I could never do that. And you know what? Maybe we're right. That kind of forgiveness is beyond anything we imagine. It's certainly beyond anything we could do on our own. At the same time, radical forgiveness is something that characterized the life and teachings of Jesus. There's no doubt about it, Jesus lived a questionable life. And throughout this series, we are looking at some of the questions people asked Jesus because his life continually sparked curiosity. One of Jesus' friends, Matthew, witnessed many of these questions and recorded them in the book he wrote about Jesus' life. In the 18th chapter of his book, Matthew shares this account. Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Now, let's stop there for just a second to explain a little background. Peter, who was a Jew, knew that the normal Jewish expectation regarding forgiveness was 3 times. The rabbis recognized that repeat offenders might not be sincerely repenting, so they instructed people to forgive them 3 times. But on the 4th offense, you're out. No more forgiveness. So when Peter comes to Jesus asking if he should forgive 7 times, he probably feels like he's being magnanimous. After all, that would be more than 2 times the cultural norm. He might have expected Jesus to commend him. But Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Jesus shocks Peter by multiplying his generous 7 by 11. Now, the point is not the number itself, but the exaggeration of the number. In other words, Jesus is not saying we shouldn't forgive on the 78th time, but instead, we should forgive indefinitely. Jesus has told Peter to forgive not 7 times, but however many times it takes. He then illustrates the point with a parable. He says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay their debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. So here we have a servant who owes his manager a debt so large he can't possibly pay it back. If we calculated that amount in today's dollars, the servant owes the manager about $2.5 billion. Just in case you're wondering, that's a heap of cash. That is an amount of money that I wouldn't possibly see in multiple lifetimes. And the master wants his money back. Knowing he couldn't pay, the master threatens to sell the servant's family into slavery. Now, the thought here is not about repayment, because the revenue from selling a slave would never cover the amount of that debt. It was solely about punishment. But the master took pity on the servant instead of punishing him and canceled the debt. And so here we see Jesus' story continue. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown in prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said. I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. No sooner had the servant left than he does a little debt collection of his own, right? He finds someone that owes him about $4,000. Now, I know that's still a substantial amount of money. If someone owed that to me, I would want it back as well. But obviously, this debt pales in comparison to the debt he was just forgiven. Why did the servant not forgive the $4,000? I think that's a great question worth exploring. And honestly, I fundamentally believe the reason he didn't forgive is because he didn't really understand what it meant to be forgiven. Which leads me to the most important thing that I'm going to say today. It is impossible to be a forgiving person until I fully embrace that I am a forgiven person. Let me repeat that so it sinks in a little bit more. It is impossible to be a forgiving person until I fully embrace that I am a forgiven person. As we think about the parable Jesus just told, the primary hope Jesus had by telling it was that we would understand we are the servant who has been forgiven $2.5 billion. The debt we owed God for the sins we committed against him was so great, there's no way we could ever pay it. But Jesus assumed our debt. He canceled it, and it cost him. However, despite being forgiven $2.5 billion like the servant, we often struggle to forgive $4,000 offenses as well. Have you ever thought about how hard it is to forgive others of even the most trivial infractions? Like, I have a hard time forgiving the person who steals my parking spot. I have a hard time forgiving my spouse for being late to an important gathering. I have a hard time forgiving the person at the grocery store who's in the 12-item express lane with 14 items. We can have a hard time forgiving the mildest of offenses, much less the greater debts people owe us, like the dad who abandoned our family when we were just a kid, the close friend or business partner who betrayed our trust in our relationship, the spouse who walked out on us, leaving us relationally devastated along with a mountain of bills. I struggle with $4,000 debts. A couple years ago, a former coworker posted some rumors about me on Facebook and Twitter and MySpace. Fortunately, no one uses MySpace anymore, so the damage was somewhat contained. But to our mutual friends, I was now the enemy. He was angry with me because I let him go from his job. After several months of conversation, it just had to be done. And he was hurt, and he took his hurt to social media. About 6 months after the episode, we sat down together at a coffee shop and both apologized for any wrongdoing in the relationship. He rejoined our church as a key volunteer, and we're friends to this day. But I still hold on to those few posts he made and all the people who read them and the bad seed put out about me for the entire world to see. And although I've forgiven him, I still struggle with forgiving him. Does that make sense? I think the reason I have a hard time continually forgiving him is because forgiving him cost me something. It cost me my reputation in the eyes of others. He owes me a Facebook post begging and groveling for forgiveness in front of others. He owes me my integrity. He owes me my good name again. I mean, have you ever thought about forgiveness and the offenses in that way? Like, what does my father owe me for abandoning the family? Maybe he owes me my childhood. He owes me some memories. He never even showed up at any of my piano recitals. And to forgive him says he wins and I lose, which is why we have such a hard time forgiving, isn't it? So there's this great cost to forgiving someone. But have you ever considered the converse? Have you ever considered the great cost to not forgiving? You see, I would argue that the cost of unforgiveness is actually greater than the cost of forgiveness. At the end of Jesus' parable, the unforgiving servant is thrown into prison for his lack of forgiveness. And many times we experience that firsthand. When we choose not to forgive, when we choose to hold on to a grudge against someone who has wounded us, we find ourselves living in a prison of hate, a prison of anger, a prison of bitterness. Yes, there is a cost to forgiving others, but it pales in comparison to the cost of not forgiving. Author N.T. Wright says it this way: forgiveness is more like the air in your lungs. There's only room for you to inhale the next lungful when you've just breathed out the previous one. If you insist on withholding it, refusing to give someone else the kiss of life they may desperately need, you won't be able to take in any more yourself, and you will suffocate very quickly. So could it be when we cancel the debt of others, the person actually being freed is you and is me? Now, before we go on, let me clarify what forgiveness is and is not. Forgiveness is not a choice that immediately makes the pain and hurt go away. Forgiveness does not change the past, although it can create opportunities for the future. Forgiveness is also not a choice to trust. Many times there is good reason not to trust someone immediately again. It is not necessarily about placing ourselves back into a situation where that same person can hurt us again and again. Instead, forgiveness is the choice to cancel a debt. When someone has done something that hurt me or harmed my future, in a sense they owe me. But the choice to forgive is a choice to say, I'm canceling the debt. You don't owe me anymore. And if we think deeply about it for a moment, I mean, how could they repay you anyway? How does a father who abandoned his children or a spouse who walked out on their lover, how does that debt get repaid? We can't go back and relive our childhood. We can't get the years of pain and misery back anyway. So when someone owes us, we assume they can repay it, but they can't. This is why the high cost of forgiving others is actually very freeing to us. So how do we become people that forgive? You know, for most of us, it's almost impossible to muster up what it takes to cancel someone's debt on our own. But I still believe we can become forgiving people. Look where the Apostle Paul says this forgiveness come from. He says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. And I think those two words in the middle make all the difference. Just as. Paul says to do unto others just as God has done unto you. Not to do unto others just as they deserve, not do unto others just as they have already done to you, but instead do unto others just as God, through Jesus, has done to you. Understand, God has invited us into a relationship characterized by love and forgiveness. And he says, in light of this relationship, I want you to do unto others what I have already done for you. And let's be honest, this is very counterintuitive. Everything in us wants to treat people in the same way they treated us, or treat them in the way we believe they deserve. But God says, I gave up my one and only Son on your behalf. You didn't get what you deserved. Instead, you received forgiveness and grace. And when we let that truth travel from our heads to our hearts, it changes everything. It calls me to something different, empowering me to respond in a counterintuitive way. Sure, they don't deserve it, but neither do I. Sure, they aren't worthy, but neither am I. We can find the power to forgive when we divert our attention away from the person who has hurt us and refocus our attention on the one who has forgiven us. You become a forgiving person when you fully embrace you are a forgiving person. When Donald Craybill, co-author of Amish Grace, researched the nickel mines tragedy, he said, none of the Amish said, I hope the killer rots in hell. I hope God punishes him. In contrast, Craybill writes, one Amish man said to me, I wish for the killer in his eternal destiny the same as I wish for myself, meaning that he hoped God would be merciful. You become a forgiving person when you fully embrace you are a forgiven person. But here's the thing. This series is about living a questionable life, a life causing others to ask, who are you? Why are you doing that? But the truth is, no one's going to ask questions about $4,000 forgiveness, are they? $100,000 forgiveness evokes questions. $1 million forgiveness evokes questions. The Amish story of forgiveness evokes questions. Now, do I think I could forgive a $1 million or $1 billion debt? Honestly, right now, I'm not sure I could. But I want to become a person who will. The Amish have a long established culture of not holding grudges against anyone, from parents to children to coworkers and friends. Their faith in God teaches them to forgive quickly. And I believe that's the reason they were able to forgive a debt in the millions, because over the years, in situation after situation, they practiced forgiving $4,000 debts quickly and consistently. And so that's the challenge for today, to be people who practice forgiving $4,000 debts quickly and consistently. When we are faced with an offense, let's choose to respond as an already forgiven person and let that reality empower us to forgive others. Living a questionable life means, we forgive before the other person ever apologizes. We forgive even if everyone around us is crying out for vengeance. We forgive even though they really do owe us something. Our lives will begin to evoke curiosity. And when people ask us, who are you? Why are you doing that? We can then point them to the God who loves and forgives them too. 8 years after it took place, I'm still very moved by the Amish story. But if you think about the story, we don't really know the name of any one particular person in the Amish community who forgave. We know the names of those they forgave, but even when you read the news stories, they don't say Jim forgave or Sue forgave. The stories always describe how the Amish community forgave. Perhaps one of the reasons it is such a powerful example of grace is because the whole community has become known for its questionable forgiveness. Now imagine if our community could become known for that. There are a lot of things we could be known for as a church, but what if we became known for our questionable forgiveness? What if we were known as a community marked by grace? What if we were known as a community characterized by unconditional love? My friends, I think that is the kind of community that God uses to change the world. Our mission at Community has always been very clear, helping people find their way back to God. And part of the way we fulfill this mission is to live lives that are so compelling, so intriguing, that people would start questioning, Who are you? And why are you doing that? May you and I live lives of questionable forgiveness. So when the unbelieving world looks at us, they see a picture of our gracious and forgiving God.